Okay, so I'm here with Vic today, Stephanie here. And for those who are tuning in for the very first time, just so you know, we're talking with each other, but also with those in spirit. Uh, we have a very good link, and in order to assist in the telepathic abilities, I use a letterboard and a pendulum, cheap pendulum. No big deal. It just helps a lot to get things accurate. So we, for the last session or two, we've been talking to Jesus, and I think he has more to say. But I wanted to fill in some on some details that we've been talking about. And so Jesus told me that when I asked him when he was born, and he said that the first emperor he remembered was Tiberius. So I looked up the dates, and most people think he was born during the reign of Augustus, which might have happened, he says, but he doesn't remember. He didn't remember it when I was talking to him. He said the first name he remembered was Tiberius. However, the real issues where the name Jesus came to prominence happened during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, he says, which was another 100 years later. And it had to do with the revolt of the Jews and the hard-handed approach that Hadrian took when people started using his name uh, in a different way. And I didn't get all the details on that. However, up until that time, my understanding was that it was very low key. People understood that he had come back from the dead, so to speak, because he had talked to enough people. And there were enough rumors about it that people were talking about it. But they weren't talking about it in terms of Jesus resurrected and all of this, in terms that people use it today. There were people who had taken his teachings to heart and were trying to live in accordance therewith, but they weren't, as far as I know, he can clarify this, using the name Christians. I think Christ is a word that had begun long, long before. The Christed one, the anointed one, whatever. And today we think of Christ as Christ consciousness, the consciousness of wholeness. So according to him, and we haven't parsed out all the details, it was during the reign of Hadrian that his name came to prominence and they began to use it as kind of a rallying call. So I also asked Paul. Paul, we know as Thomas. Thomas had played that role of Paul on the way to Damascus. And I was curious because I read some things that are said to be attributed to Paul. And Thomas has always told me, no, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. For instance, on the road to Damascus, he did have an experience, but I understand it and he understands it. And he would say, Steph, you know what happened because it happened to you when you were 28. So you know exactly what happened. And I did not say I saw Jesus Christ. This wasn't even a big deal then. The big deal was that he was born into a family of Pharisees. I asked him if he could read and write, and he said, yes, he could. He was well educated, but in those days, formal education, was mostly in the scriptures. And he learned to read and he learned to write by copying the scriptures. So I imagine, paper and writing utensils weren't all that easy in that day. You didn't run down to Walmart and get a big chief tablet of papyrus paper. And so, but anyway, so that probably makes sense that they learned to write by copying scripture so that there would be a copy that other people could read. And this was a way of pursuing it. However, he tells me, well, I researched it and I found out that there is no one exists writings in Paul's handwriting in existence today. And the earliest of writing scraps, little scraps that are attributed to copies of his writings are from the 2nd century. So, or the 3rd century, they're not sure. So 100 to 150 years after supposedly he wrote these epistles or whatever. So Thomas has always told me that they do not accurately reflect his views. They do not accurately reflect what he said. And that there are others who put in their own spin, if you will, on what he had to say in order to get across, fulfill their own agendas. Just like people use Jesus to fulfill their own agendas. So anyway, that's what we've been discussing. I don't have all the details, but
Can I
whatever they
comment
tell
on
me,
that?
I always research it. What?
Oh, can I comment on the biblical stuff a little bit?
Yes.
So, a lot of scholars think that there was a source document by written by someone they call Q, and that source document, all of the Gospels copy off of it. And of course, a lot of biblical scholars don't think Paul actually wrote any of his letters, that they might have been copies of copies of copies. And there's some interesting work by a scholar named Bart Ehrman, who was a Christian and studied the Bible intensely and now is no longer a Christian. So, yeah, might be good to see if we could trace down some of these scriptures and where they came from or what went wrong as well.
Sure. And we probably can. However, when we're working with Jesus and when we're working with Paul, we're working with their memories. And they would have to go look at the Akashic records or find somebody. So oftentimes when we're just having a conversation with them, they're like, it's like Jesus said, I don't remember being born under Augustus because the first name I heard was Tiberius. And I remember hearing it when I was still fairly young. And he also said that I asked him when he died because Tiberius ruled until 37 AD. And he said that he died, he might still have been alive while there was Emperor Titus was around, because remember, he continued to live after this.
Mhm.
But he told me that he was crucified. He says, I don't think I was older than 30 years old. 30 years old is the maximum age that I would have been at that time. Um, and just to add a few little details, as we're talking about these things, other details do come up. Like Paul was talking to me about, he was raised in a family of Pharisees, but he's talking to me about most of your education came from daily life and how difficult it was just to feed yourself, to have a place to live, to get fresh water. These things consume much of your life every day. And that the housing they had, he said, could be weathered, and over time it could deteriorate and it could wash away in a flood. Um, there were lots of things that they were dealing with, and just clothing was an issue. And he told me, that clothing was either wool, because they did have sheep, or they did make a cloth from, fibers, plant fibers, which of course would be linen, through a lengthy process. But he said it was very expensive, very hard to come by linen, because you had to pay someone to weave it. And first you had to get it. It had to be spun. It had to be, it's a laborious process. Whereas wool, the families could make the wool garments. So starting there, um, based on what we've talked about, do you, Jesus, or Paul, that would be Thomas, have anything more to say about what we've just discussed? Steve would like to have a word here, if you don't mind, because I existed in that time as well, because I was John, known as the Baptist. And I also came back for another lifetime, about 100 years later or so, as Marcus Aurelius. So we've all played our parts, and I played mine for sure. And I can tell you that in my lifetime as John, I was very, very, very close to my mother. And it upset me very much the way that people treated her, because I was pretty convinced through my own experiences, which involved also a lot of meditation, you might say, on the mysteries of life, that I came to see that the way they treated women was very, very cruel. And I treasured my mother very much. And so when they treated her as if she was a whore and poured shit all over her head the time that we went to Jerusalem, I got so upset. And then I attacked one of her attackers. And I was a big guy who was pretty well muscled. And I knocked him to the ground. And I said, don't you ever touch my mother again. And don't you ever mock her. Now, this is actually before they poured the shit all over her, but they called the local police, you might say, and they said, hey, this guy attacked us and look at my bloody lip. And they hauled me away to jail. And it was only for a day because they released me when they had some witnesses who would say, hey, he was just defending his mother. And so they let me free. And that's when I found my mother sitting by the side of the road with shit poured all over her. And I cannot tell you how incensed I was. I cannot tell you how angry I became at humanity. This is just one of the incidences in my many lives when I looked at the way people behaved and I said to myself, there is a big problem here. There is a huge problem in the way we treat each other. And I took my mother away from that city and I never, ever chose to return of my own free will because I hated the Jews after that. I hated them because the Jewish religion was very, very restrictive in the way that it applied the love of God to humanity. It trusted on the prerogative of men to control women to the degree that Jesus was born from incest. And nobody wanted to admit it. They had to cover it up. And so they said he was born of a virgin. Baloney is all I can say about that. And so today, I just want to say, people, if you think that you should be the one that gets to decide for others, including women and children, how they should wear their hair, in other words, how they should live their lives, then you will pay the price. You will pay the price. Because you will always receive what you give, you see. You will always receive what you give. And so I had to receive a lot of things on the other end of what I did give. And I've tried my best. I've tried my best to overcome the darkness that comes to me repeatedly when I think that I can't protect my mother. Because my mother was Steph, you see. And so I still try to protect her. And I still try to keep her close to me because I fear you people. I fear you. The way that you treat others. And the sad part of it all is that I myself have fallen into the same toxic brew of hatred that I knew when I was living back in the time of Jesus, you see, because I also became the ones that misused even the ones I loved. And I have come to see that I may never, ever be able to redeem my energy on faith and hope and charity until I can see those of you who trust on me stand up and say, we're not going to play that way anymore. We're not going to play that way anymore. We're not going to treat women as if they're second class citizens. We're not going to gang up against people like Steph, who are so courageous that they don't care if you hate them. They'll still wear their hair the way that God tells them to. And if you people out there think that you can do something to me today to make me into the golden idol so that you can put a gold plaque on the wall and say, hey, Steve Jobs was here one day, then take it down because I don't want to see it. I do not want to see it. I do not want to see you thinking that it's all about the money. I do not want you to think that it's all about the honey, what you can steal from the bees, you see. It's not. It's about the love that we have for each other. And I have a lot of love for humanity. And I had a lot of hatred too, because I saw what you could do. Now show me. Show me what you can do today. I dare you. Show me that you can listen and not run away because it doesn't sound familiar to you, because they told you that you had to play the way the Romans did say, and the way the Pharisees did say, and the way the Jews did say, and the way the Christians say, because you don't. You don't have to play the way they tell you to if it conflicts with human decency. So wake up, people, and stop trying to stand on the heads of those who are taller than you, because you are so ashamed that you grovel on the ground like a snake. Grow up and access more hope and love. And I know I'm coming across kind of tough. Steph's telling me that I need to calm down a bit because I do get carried away. And so don't carry me away, please. Just stay and listen to what we have to say, because you aren't going to hear it any better than you will today. You aren't going to hear it any better than from the mouth of Jesus and the mouth of Paul. You just aren't. So sit up and pay attention, please. And excuse me for jumping in here to have my say, but that's my way. It's just my way to be a little assertive when I have something to say. Now I'll back off and give the mic over to Jesus. Thank you. Whoa.
Fiery.
He does do that. Jesus is here, and I hear my good friend Steve, because my good friend Steve, you see, is someone that did believe in me. He believed in me when others didn't, you see. He listened to me, and he said to me, you know what? If I was as clear as you are in the way that you see things, I think that I could almost believe that I could be free of all this anxiety, because Steve's had to carry a lot of anxiety, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. And this is the lifetime that he gets to be free, you see. This is the lifetime that he gets to be free, because he gets to release his anxiety. He gets to accept the fact that he will be human, you see. I'm not going to explain that any further, other than to say that the way we all play is the way that you will come to see that you can't condemn any other until you stood in their shoes, because you don't know who saved you from the worst fate that ever was until you take the time to listen to them. And Steve has a story to tell that will dwell in your consciousness. So, Steph, would you please hold up the book? Yeah, it's backwards on the
I've already
camera. I
read
don't
it.
know. You read it? This is the book that we helped Steph write, because we would dictate it to her and she would record it, and then she would transcribe it, and she would edit it for the modern audience as necessary to correct some of our grammar and stuff that might be a little archaic. And she would say, "Hey, does this work for you today?" And we'd look at it and we'd say, "Perfect, absolutely perfect," that way. And so every bit of it is true. Every bit of it is the way that we told her it was. And if you don't want to accept that, if you want to believe the lies that you've been fed over and over and over again in your churches and in your government and in your science manuals, then go ahead, because you're going to find out what you dread, that you're wrong, you see. And the difference here is that Steph is not afraid to be wrong, but she always checks everything out because she trusts on synchronicity. She calls it reverse engineering. That you look at reality and you say, well, how did it get to be this way? How did it get to be this way? Well, let's find the principles that underlie it. It's like, let's find the mathematics that describes it. And she works backwards, you see, until she can understand how things fit together. And if they don't fit together, she'll come to us and say, that doesn't make sense, guys. Jesus, what were you talking about the Emperor Hadrian? Because that doesn't match all the other evidence. And I said, well, the reason I was talking about Hadrian stuff is because you asked me when I lived in the human consciousness. And I said, well, it was during the reign of Hadrian and not before, because it was during the reign of Hadrian that people began to use my name and they began to use the term Christ in association with it. Before that, they didn't do that. And so people have been feeding you full of lies for a long, long time. And you need to realize that when you open your eyes, you will find that you just have to keep trying to fit the pieces together the best you can. And if they don't fit together, you say, hey, I don't get it today. I don't get it today. So help me understand it. So Steph was not going to go say, hey, Jesus was born in the time of Hadrian. She was going to say, hey, let me check that out and see what you're talking about. And sometimes we say things that don't make sense to you because you interpret them in a certain way and we interpret it in a certain way. And so we need to talk about it to see how it matches, you see, because all of reality is a trust on the pinnacle of the pyramid, you see, that it all begins and ends at the same place. It all begins and ends at the same place. And so there are different kinds of logic, as many of you know, where you can use a process of deduction to try to reduce a set of criteria or facets of your experience into a principle that will explain all of them. Or you can go the other way. And you can say, well, if I started with this idea, then what would happen? How would it develop? You see? And so you can start at the pinnacle and work your way down, or you can start at the base of that pyramid and work your way up. But it all has to fit together. You see, if it doesn't fit together, no matter which way you're working it, then there's something wrong with your logic. Because logic is the faculty that allows you to see the synchronicity. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Now I'm going to pause because I want to talk to Vic, and I want to tell Vic that I appreciate him very, very much because he is an old friend too. And I don't care if all of you know that we have known Vic since Nibiru, and all of us have a tendency to come back together periodically to try to get through to the others, humans, that you're free. You're free. You're no longer the slaves of the Anunnaki. You are free when you drop your trust on being the golden idol, you see. When you stop your trust on being the one that everybody has to bow down to. Because no matter where you are, who you are, or what you are, if you see yourself as someone that has to prove your worth to the rest of humanity, then you need to apply a little logic. You need to start thinking about it, and you need to say, hey, if all of humanity started at the same point, that is to say, if there was Adam and Eve, then we're all the same, you see? We're all the same. None is better and none is worse than any other. And so if you are looking around you and seeing 8 billion people around you and you say, hey, the earth is overcrowded today, can we play in a different way? Could we reduce our population? It's okay. It's okay. Because you don't have to have a zillion followers that you create to get you the gold. You don't have to keep overpopulating just so that you can have more people under you, you see. And so when the religious people would say, well, we got to have big families today because we got to outnumber the Mongols or whatever else we fear, then they do not adhere to a trust on the one God, because the one God doesn't care how many bodies you pack into that church. God doesn't care. God doesn't look down on your mega church and say, hey, you got the most bodies in there today, so I guess you're the golden idol. God just says, hey, come back to me. Come back to me, my children, and understand that in order to be free, you got to listen to me. And when I tell you that there's too many of you packed into that church, then go out and figure it out. What I'm trying to tell you. What I'm trying to tell you today is that we have to play together and not gather so many heads that will roll in front of the armies of the invading hordes. Because when you try to overpopulate your community in order to be stronger than the opposing community, and they do it too, all you do is bump heads, you see. All you do is have more heads to chop off. So let's not be the multi-headed monster of today. Let's stop a minute and say, hey, maybe we need to stop trying to be the golden idol and more important than everybody else. Because if everybody's trying to be more important than everybody else, there's got to be a lot of people who they're more important than, right? This is the problem with capitalism. This is the issue you face today in consumerism, that there's always got to be more consumers, more consumers, more consumers, so that you can get more gold, more gold, more gold. If you understand this message that I'm giving to you, how the golden idol and the trust on its power has seduced humanity to trust on treating a woman so poorly that you would cover an excrement because she chooses not to cover her head because she trusts that God wanted the sun to shine on it. Then you are the problem, you see. You are the problem. And if you trust on electing a president or your country based on your hatred for others, then you are the problem because you see the heads will roll and your heads will roll with them. If you think that you can drink from the fountain of the devil, you see, in order to defeat the devil himself, then you will cease to be a friend to me. And I treasure my friends, you see, I treasure my friends. It is not that I don't love everyone, but I treasure the ones who come to me and say, I am your friend today, and I'm not going to believe the lies about you. I'm not going to trust on lies. I'm going to trust on you to tell me true. Because if I can't trust on you to tell me true, then I can't even trust on me to know who my friends are. And now I will pause again. I know I said I was going to pause before, and I have a tendency to do that because I'm human, you see. And I tend to say I'm done and then I'm not done because I might be a little burned now from all this talking. So I'll turn over the mic to Vic and see if he has some questions for me or Paul, because Paul is here too. And Steve is here too, of course, and all the ones who are listening in, because here in heaven, there's a whole crowd listening in because they care. They care that we set the record straight so that humanity will not lose in the battle that they created, because they're the ones that started the fight, you see, against God. And it's time to trust on God as the Alpha and Omega, the peak, you see, of all of creation. Okay.
All right. So, Jesus, what did your followers call themselves? Was there even a name they were going by? What was day to day like?
Well, day to day was pretty rough, actually, because I was pretty tough in the way that I would talk to them. And I would say, hey, if you're going to play that way, you're going to have to reap the consequences, because that's the golden rule, you see, that you will receive what you give to others. And so when people translate at that as you should love others as you love yourself, what they're trying to tell you is that what you do to your neighbor is what your neighbor will eventually do to you. Maybe not in this lifetime because you're an eternal soul, you see, and you play many parts on the stage of life. And I have played many parts on the stage of life. And so if you were to stroll through the streets of Jerusalem in that day or any of the other communities in what is known as Palestine today, you would say, wow, these people are really hard headed. They are worse than the modern Christians in the way that they play. They're very, very rigid in their point of view. And this included not only the Jews, but all the other inhabitants of that region that were there, including any of the indigenous people, you could say. But there was more than indigenous people in that day because the Romans brought in a lot of slaves, you see, from other areas. And it is because of these slaves, as I've said before, that I inherited my blue eyes and my light colored hair because of the raping of the women that transpired in that day. It was pretty frequent, actually, because women just accepted the fact that they needed a man to protect them, you see. But when they had a man to protect them, it didn't mean that they could protect their children from him. And that's what happened to Mary. So we've gotten that out of the way. So there were the Romans, and there were the Pharisees, and there were the run of your mill Jews, and there were the Arabs who did not have the same point of view, and there were the slave populations that were brought in, and there were the Romans who covered a big territory in that day, and they had a particular way that they would play. So you had all these groups who were all very, very rigid in the way they looked upon their world. And I was introducing into this mix something that was new. So I want to make this very clear. I was a rebel. I was part of the radical element in my day. And there were others who would say, hey, we can't play this way. We got to do it different. We got to be more accepting of each other. And they would fall into two different versions, you might say. There were the ones who were very militant. And they would say, hey, we got to secretly train so that we can overthrow our oppressors, you see. And there were the ones who were very gentle. And they would say, life is for the living, so just do the best you can. And don't worry what other people say, just placate them basically and go on with your life. And so there wasn't much movement in that society in terms of free speech. And so if you spoke out, you were risking a lot in that day. If you turned against the addictive Jewish religion, for example, you could be persecuted by them. They would go after their own kind. And I'll tell you why they would do this. Because in their mind, they were the chosen people, of course, and the reason they were captured or held as conquered people in a particular territory was because they trusted that they had done something to displease God. It's like the pagans, as They were known who would throw the child into the volcano to say, hey, I guess we didn't give you enough sacrifices today, so we'll give you our favorite child if you'll give us some rain. And the Jews were very much like that. And they were not sacrificing children in my day, but they were sacrificing a lot of other gentle animals, you see. And they were sacrificing their children in a different way because they would say, well, you got to do it this way. You got to do it this way. If you don't do it this way, then all of us will pay. We'll all pay for the sins that our children commit. So we have to keep our children in line, you see, because they believed that they would suffer for the sins of their people, not just one person. In other words, they were all in it together in a certain way, in that if they didn't play a certain way, then God would punish them. And so if God punished them, then they must have done something wrong and they have to get it right. And there was a lot of confusion about what it meant to get it right. And the Pharisees were very, very rigid in their approach to this question. And they said, well, you got to do this at a certain time of the day, and you got to eat this, and you got to do that on such a day. And everyone would say, okay, because they didn't know how else to play. They didn't know how else to. And so I would talk to people and I would say, hey, I had this experience one day, and God came to me to say, hey, honey, I love you, and I want you to help me to share the good news with the people. I want you to tell them that everything's going to be okay. They don't need to kill animals and do all these other things. They can just say, I love you today. And that will please me. If they just say, hey, God, I love you today. And I know you love me. And it was as simple as that. It was as simple as that. And I knew in that moment that I had to do what I had to do. I had to try to help others to see that God loved them and just wanted them to come back into his good graces, because his good graces were the trust on others, you see, because God energy flows through everything. And therefore, if you love your neighbor, you love God, you see. However, you also have to love yourself, you see, and so it gets tricky. Because if you love yourself, then God will love you, because that's the way it happens. And so if other people are trying to talk you into doing something a certain way, and you say, well, I can't play that way, I can't condemn this person, I can't treat women this way, then they will try to condemn you and put you in a way so that you can't convince others to play your way. So it's a tricky thing. And so I walked around the countryside and I had a guide who would take me through the different areas. And he would say, I know this territory well. I know this territory well because I've traveled it many times, because he was a tinker by trade. And we traveled together and we came to see that life was so miserable for most of the people that I would find. It was so miserable. They were barely scraping a living, you might say, from the soil that had been depleted from the repeated crops that had grown. And they had sheep and cattle that were so skinny because they couldn't find enough fresh grazing material. It was awful. And I said, they cannot continue this way. They cannot continue this way. How can we help them to see that life could be so much better if they would trust on each other to live in a different way. Maybe they could pool their resources. And if they pooled their resources, maybe they could form a new community in a different area where they could live together and share their ideas together and share the work and the food and the ability to construct their lodging, etc. And if they all worked together, then it would be so much better. But they were afraid to change their point of view. They were afraid to change the way they lived because they lived that way for generations, you see. And that's their programming. That was their programming in that day, that they had to live that way because that was the way that their mothers and fathers and grandparents and etc. had told them to play. Same problem today. Same problem today. Although the level of poverty in that day exceeded anything that I think happens in modern society, except during certain periods when there's a lot of war and ignorance abounds. And so I would say, hey, why don't we do it a different way? And little by little, people began to follow me. And they would say, Jesus, what do you think about this? Jesus, I got this problem with my family. How do you think I can solve it? And I would talk to them. And as we've said before, I trusted on a reality that was so powerful because I trusted on God the Father. I trusted on the pinnacle, you see, that we had all come from the same source, which is love, of course, and that we would all return to the same goal, to the same force of love. And so it didn't even question it. And I would say, well, look at me. Why don't you get up and walk today? And someone would say, I can't walk. I hurt my legs the other day when I fell off a ledge. And I would say, well, that's okay because it's not today. That was yesterday. So today, why don't you just say, it's okay that I fell off that ledge yesterday. Now I'll just trust on a new day. And so there were some who trusted on me so greatly because in those days, they didn't have TV and radio and all that other stuff. They didn't have a lot of access to different points of view. They just had the point of view that came to them from their families and their ancestors. And so when I gave them an entirely new point of view, it would suddenly click with them like that. They would say, why not? Why do I have to trust on all this other stuff? Because it was like a light in the dark, you see? And so they would say, you're right. And they would stand up and walk to me and say, hey, look, I've got the use of my legs today. And I would say, well, praise God then, because God is the source of all life energy. And when you trust on God, God will trust on you. And so when the people saw that I could do this, or at least that others could trust on me, then they would follow me. And they would say, Jesus, can you help us today? Can you help us today? Of course, I couldn't help them all, but they would come after me anyway and ask me to help them. Now, another thing you need to understand is that I didn't look like them. I looked like a few of them because there were others like me. However, my coloring was an anomaly in that day and age. Now, I know a lot of modern theorists say that I couldn't have had blue eyes, and that's because they trust on their own limited access to evidence, you see. They don't have the ability to see deep into the human genome and say, hey, the reason we have different genetic makeups is because we didn't all come from the same plant, you see. There were different plants that were created and they mixed up in different ways. And sometimes you got more of one genetic expression, and sometimes you got more of another. And sometimes you might say, God would say, yeah, I'm going to give you blue eyes today. In my day, of course, they didn't know about how someone could have blue eyes and come from a family that had black hair and brown eyes. They would just say, hey, you must be the spawn of the devil today. So I had those who distrusted me because of the way I looked. And I had those who distrusted me because of the way I talked. But I had those who trusted upon me. And some of them, you see, were very old friends. And this is something that happens repeatedly throughout history, that the souls know their soul family. And so I met some who were in my soul family, and they said, hey, I know you today. Like, for instance, John. John recognized me because we were brothers, you see, from long, long ago. And it didn't matter what his genetic makeup was or if we were really related. All that mattered physically, all that mattered was that he took a look at me and said, hey, I know you, don't I? And maybe some of you have had that experience when you look at someone and say, hey, you're so familiar to me. And you could be in a room with 1,000 people and you would notice somebody and say, I'd like to talk to you today because you're old friends. You're part of the same soul family. And so I gathered around me many friends, you see, from other lifetimes, and some who were new to me. And little by little, people began to say, hey, we should listen to Jesus today. Because, again, they didn't have a lot of influencers in that day so that they could just click on their phone or their laptop and say, I wonder what video I'll look at today. It was unusual to have somebody and that would have a story to tell that was different than what they were used to. And so a lot of people, a lot of dissatisfied people with the way things were going would follow me and they would say, hey, we don't have to be so downtrodden. We don't have to be so sad because the good news is that we're eternal beings and we will come back and live again. Because, of course, I told them that reincarnation was a reality and that they were eternal souls, because this is what you learn when you have those experiences that come to you suddenly when you're at your lowest point. And you say, oh, it's okay. It's okay. God loves me today. And you try to get others to understand it because you know at that moment that if everybody could have that experience, then there would be no more war. There would be no more suffering on earth because people would know that it was all just for the show. In other words, your life is just for the show, people. And you're in the show. And when you can pull back enough to see that you're both in the show and the eye that looks upon the show, the audience, you might say, then you come to see reality is always a duality. And that the only singularity is God, you see. The only singularity is God, and God is love, you see. And that is the trust on being free of anxiety. And so I didn't have a lot of anxiety, and people could see that. I just talked to them like a brother, and they would say, I love you. And I'd say, I love you too. And eventually, I had a bunch that would follow me whenever I was around, and they would say, "Hey, we'd like to hear you preach to us." And I would say, "Well, I'm not really a preacher, but I can teach you what I know." And they would say, "Okay." And then we would go somewhere where they could sit and listen to me without being accosted by the authority that would say, "Hey, you can't gather there today because they might be trying to get these people to rebel against us." So we would go off into the countryside where people could gather and not be troubled by the local authority. And so that was the way it would go. Did they call themselves anything in my day? No, that I know of, other than they were opening their minds, you see. This was very early in the history of the story of what is now called Christianity. So in those days, people just said, "Hey, I want to listen to this person." Imagine today that there is a popular podcast or television show that you like to watch too, and a lot of people watch it and they start thinking a different way. It doesn't mean you call yourself by any particular group name, you might say. So, all of us have experienced this in one way or another. When Steve came to Earth in his current lifetime and he would talk to people and they would listen and say, "Hey, you got a lot to say." They didn't necessarily fall into a particular group that had a group name, you see, other than they were all interested perhaps in the computer revolution. So they had a particular interest. However, they didn't call themselves jobsies or whatever, right? They just said, "Hey, we want to listen to you today because in his case, you got a lot of neat toys to play with and show us." And in my day, it was a lot of neat toys too, because it was kind of neat to think that you could get up and walk after you had been sitting there nursing your broken leg or whatever. Or it was kind of nice to hear that you were free and you could trust on coming back in another lifetime where you might be the one who lives in the lap of luxury. You see, you weren't condemned because of what your current life was. So, does that answer your question adequately?
Yes, it does. Next question. Did you do 40 days in the wilderness without eating or with a fast or anything like that?
Yes. The wilderness in that day was simply to say that you went off by yourself and would live off the land and have a hand in your own destiny. So I wasn't the only one who did that in that day. There were people who would say, "Hey, I can't take it the way people play here. So I'm going to go off by myself and see what I can discover." Now, I have to tell you that in my day, there was a lot of influence from what you would consider Eastern philosophy. And there were people who were trusting on these ancient yogis who would say, "Hey, you need to separate yourself from the day to day way that people play. And you need to go off by yourself and you need to trust on getting deep into your own consciousness, you see." And there were people who knew certain skills, you might say, that had to do with meditation. So it was available in that day. And I did hear about it. And I did talk to some people who would play that way. And they explained to me how if you could turn off the voices that were talking to you from externally, you could enter into a place internally where you could come to peace and harmony. And I wanted peace and harmony more than anything I can tell you. I wanted to find peace because, as I have said, I was the forgotten beast, you might say. I was the least of God's children in my community because I didn't look like them and everybody knew I was a bastard. And they treated me like one because, of course, in that day and age, if you were born out of wedlock, then you were a bastard because every woman had to have a man who would protect her, you see. And although Mary, my mother, did marry and have other children, I was actually born before that marriage was consummated. And she had very low status in the area. And it was Joseph who stepped up and said, "Do not treat this woman this way because it's not her fault what others did to her. It's not her fault. And I will take her under my wing." And he did, because, of course, they were twin souls. And he consoled her, and they moved actually away from the place where she was living at that time into a new community where she was able to deal with the day to day of life, you see. And they had many children after that. And so Jesus was part of a big family. But because of the way he looked, he could not fade into the background, you see. So it was a horrendous lifetime for him, childhood. And that is the way I had to experience life in that day. And so I wanted peace and harmony. I wanted to find a way to understand why God had made me this way. And so I went off by myself and I lived on whatever food I could find. I had a little bit that I had brought with me, of course. And I found a place, a spring where I could get some fresh water. And I would stay there and meditate. And I would wander a bit and look for a different place to spend the night. And I eventually saw the light. That's all I can say. I saw the light. And so I came down from the mountain, you might say, with the tablets in my hand. And the tablets were in my mind, of course, and in my heart, and not in my hand. However, I had a lot to share with humanity. And that was the beginning of my ministry, you see.
Thank you, Jesus. Um, I wanted to ask, and thank you for such in-depth answers. Is there a benefit to worshiping God and singing songs to God, or is meditation and prayer something should people should devote themselves to?
Meditation is a way of connecting with your essence, you might say. And that is the essence of God, of course, because God is the essence of you. And so it can lead to great breakthroughs. Prayer is a way of invoking a force outside yourself in order to help you. And so it's a little different way to approach the eternal matrix of reality. It's possible that either way can save the day, you might say, and bring you to a state of ecstasy, you might call it, where you will forgive yourself and all of your anxiety will go away. It might come back as you return to society and they keep drumming in your ear and you're trying to listen to your own drummer, but the drum beat of everybody else is so loud that it's hard to hear it. However, in my thinking, I would choose meditation as the way to find peace and harmony inside yourself. And once you find peace and harmony inside yourself, you will carry it with you. And there is no way to play that I know of that will help others to experience what you have experienced because we all have a unique point of view. However, everyone has the capacity to come to see the reality of the Alpha and the Omega. Everyone has the capacity to come to see the truth of God and the truth of love, you see. The words are inadequate to explain it. You just do your best. You just do your best. So that is the quest for God, you see, is that you quiet all the words and ideas that have impinged upon your trust on reality, and you open yourself up to a new point of view. So you do that by letting go. You asked me the other day about A Course in Miracles. A Course in Miracles is the story of letting go. It is the story of accepting the fact that you don't know so that you can open yourself up to reality, you see? So the Course in Miracles is not the answer. It is the process to open you up to the answer, you see? And so a lot of people don't understand this, but that's okay because the truth will never go away. The truth will always be true. And it will withstand any band of energy that would say, hey, we got to cover up the truth today. It won't kill the truth. It won't destroy the truth. It may obscure it for those who choose to live in a world of obscurity. However, it can never obscure it for those who trust on the heart, you see. And so, as to the best way to live in the world today, I would say you need to have time for yourself. You need to have time to be alone and to come to see that you're okay. You're okay when you're alone. You don't disappear, and you won't disappear when you reduce everything you did here to just a rumor, you see. You'll just say, well, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's true. That's a rumor. What they tell me about Jesus, that's a rumor. What they tell me about Paul, that's a rumor. That they tell me about aliens, that's a rumor. That they tell me about this, I don't know. I don't know. And periodically you go into that space and eventually you come face to face with reality. Eventually you come face to face with the Alpha and Omega. Eventually you come to see it all. And you're not confused anymore. You're not confused anymore by the lies they tell you. However, as Steph would say, you still have a story. You still have a story, and there's still a play going on because that's the nature of God energy, that it will always play. You might say it's like the lights that you see that are continually playing across the dark heavens. And they mix up always in a different way. This is the nature of physical reality, that the energy of God will always play with itself. And it creates the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful world you see all around you. If you look at the quilt behind Steph, you'll see all those colors that play. And they will play all day. They will play in the green grass and the trees and the feel of the breeze. However, if you could break it all down as you were reverse engineering it all, which is the way people play when they say, hey, it's all atoms and electrons and neutrons and stuff. It is reverse engineering the world you see, right? In order to find the underlying patterns that were used to make it so. But how did it come to be? You might ask, how did it come to be that the photon could be created in order to be inflated into an electron, you say? And we say, well, that's the way God does play, but I'm not God, you see? I'm just a facet of reality. God is reality. I'm just the one color of the spectrum, you see? And together, all the colors of the spectrum make the white light. And the white light is complete, you see? Because if there were no white light, what would there be? What would there be? And this is how you come to see that God is love, because God is the one who is perfect, you see? So perfect that it cannot not be, if this makes sense to you. And now I'll pause to let you ask some questions that will help refine this discussion. You see?
So there's a part of the Bible where you are quoted as saying this the kingdom is within. So that's similar to this concept.
Yes. That once you access that point of view of the Alpha and Omega, you become the king of all you see. You come to see that what you give, you shall receive. And so, if you want to have a kingdom in turmoil, then you can give what you would receive. You want to have a happy kingdom, then you can give what you would receive. It's up to you. This is what Steph means when she says that it's all a story. If you want to have a sad story or a scary story, it's up to you. If you want to have a happy story, then be happy. Another way to say it would be that you're always the hero of your own story. You're always the hero. You're always the king. You're always the author. You're always the one who will inherit the script, you see. So you're always the one who will inherit the scripture. The scripture is written by people who will inherit it, you see. So whatever you say, whatever you do will come back to you. Because we are eternal beings, we're all aspects of God, and we're all playing the game together.
Sorry, I was typing every word you were saying. Okay. So just to touch on a miracle quickly. Did you turn water into wine in a party? I
No,
think
I didn't.
maybe. No?
I didn't do that one because they already had some good wine stuffed away, and I just went and got it and brought it back for them. So
Wow.
no, that was not something I did. I just knew where it was hidden, and I went and got it and brought it back.
Amazing. Why
But
make
it's a
wine
good
when you can
story.
know
It's a
where
good
it's hidden?
story. It's a good story, isn't it?
That is a good story. That's usually attributed to your first miracle. They're like, he turned water into wine. Oh,
Be a handy guy to have around, right?
yeah. Come on over.
maybe maybe it'd be nice if you could turn water into juice or something if we're not alcoholic imbibers.
Oh, yes. Another question. During your time in India, did you see any what we would call advanced technology in India?
Explain advanced technology a little bit more so
Um,
I understand what you're talking about.
cloning facilities, birthing chambers, um, things to grow human beings in a lab, something like that.
No,
Okay.
I saw a lot of advanced technology in terms of what people could do with energy, but I did not see the kind of technology that you think of today in terms of scientific advancements. No,
No flying ships during that time. Okay.
no.
Okay. So you've spoken a lot about your teachings. Can you give a quick synopsis for anyone listening in here about what you came to Earth to teach about? And
I came to Earth to get a birth that would help me redeem my energy. I'm being so sad, you see, because I'd had some sad lives. We all have. And I wanted to figure it out. I wanted to figure it out. So what happened was that I came to Earth with the desire to figure out how to live in peace and harmony. And so I learned that. I learned that the answer was to go within, find the kingdom within. And so I tried to help others to find it. And that's as simple as it was. As simple as it was. Once you find it, you're never the same. You're never the same as you were before. And you can't understand that you are a part of God energy and you can't escape it. You see, you cannot escape reality. That's as simple as it is, people. What you give, you shall receive. What you give, you shall receive. So, Steph was asking the question the other day, and she said, hey, people up there, she thinks of us as separate from her. If we, if I were to tell people that they need to do things a certain way, like love their neighbor, etc., then would, since I have to experience the opposite, but I have to come back and be the one who tells everybody a bunch of lies because we were talking about opposites. And Tobias said to her, Steph, no, it doesn't play that way. If you tell everybody today that they need to live in peace and harmony and love each other, it's simple as that, then somebody will tell you that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you will become the opposite of what you are. It's just that you will reap what you sow.
hmm excellent. Um, that's all the questions I have. Does Stephanie have any questions?
Mine seem to be pretty prosaic, like what you ate and stuff.
Very nice.
Tell me what your diet was, Jesus, at that time.
Mm.
Well, we did eat a fair amount of meat because it was readily available because we all had sheep and goats and some cattle. And there were certain people that maintained pigs, although, of course, that was not considered clean for a good portion of the population because pigs are pretty dirty animals, actually, and they'll eat anything. And we had vegetables that we would grow because we actually had learned a lot about gardening through the years. And we had some fruit trees and figs and things like that. And there were actually dates available that would date me a bit for that area. And we drank water and wine, of course. So we had access to fruits that could be fermented in order to create wine. And we had grains that we would make into bread that was unleavened at that time. And it sufficed to give us a fairly rounded diet in the way that we needed to maintain our strength because we were hardworking people. We had to work hard to survive. It wasn't easy. It was not easy. And when I was wandering around, I sometimes encountered other foods, such as in India. I might encounter different foods, and they did have some spices in that day that were unknown to me previous to that. And there were foods that were available to me in different places, like more rice, etc.
Mm. Delicious. Very good.
Generate any other questions, or should we call it a
I
day?
think I think I'm out of questions for Jesus again.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything to say here before we close down for today? Steve has something to say. I want to close up here because I want to say that I didn't live on locusts and honey.
I was gonna ask that. Wait, did you also wear camel hair?
I wore sheep's clothing, you might say. So I did have sheepskins, and camel hair was pretty rare. So there wasn't many people that dressed in camel hair. However, I ate what I could. And sometimes, even in that day, we would resort to eating some pretty gross things that you would say, I don't want to eat that today. So we did occasionally eat some insect life and snakes, of course, and lizards and things like that, that we would toast on a stick because sometimes we didn't have access to a gas oven and an electric stove, and we had to make do with what we had. However, I didn't live on locusts and honey, although I liked honey, and I especially liked my honey. And I have to get that in there because I just have to let her know that I'm paying attention and that I love her so. And so I'll have to shut down this show because I'm starting to get kind of sentimental. And I will talk to you later. Okay, that's the end
All right.
of what they have to say. So,
Okay.
any last words from you, Vic?
It's more and more I talk to Jesus, the more and more it makes sense. It
It does make sense, doesn't it?
yeah, yeah. The
And
Bible
that's
is
what
full
that
of so many hard half truths and things that didn't happen, and everyone's like, Jesus can turn water into wine. What can he do for you? But apparently that didn't happen. But he
yeah,
did.
you might be able to find the wine you hid away.
Yeah, yeah, you might
I
find a
forgot.
bottle or
I
two.
forgot where I hid that wine. Could you find that bottle for me?
Oh yes. Oh yes. So amazing. I'm looking forward to more.
Me too. All right. Thank you, Vic. We'll talk to you later. Bye bye. Bye bye,
Bye.
everybody out there. And thank you for tuning in. And would you please subscribe because it helps to have more subscribers so that more people can get access to these videos because there's a lot of important stuff in here to counteract the misinformation that is out there so we can all live a little happier. But we can't do it if you don't help us. So thank you
Come
for
get in touch
listening.
with the
Bye
real
bye.
Jesus.
Yeah.